People often say they think too much. The phrase comes easily, almost as a ready-made explanation for any feeling of mental fatigue, confusion, or difficulty focusing. My mind never stops. I'm thinking all the time. I can't switch off. Usually, there is an unspoken assumption behind this. Thinking too much is the problem. But when you look more closely, something about that conclusion starts to feel off. Because thinking, in itself, is not usually a bad experience. Thinking can be productive, engaging, even enjoyable at times. The discomfort shows up somewhere else. You can spend hours deeply focused on something complex, working through a real problem, organizing ideas, creating something. By the end of it, you might feel tired, but there is also a sense of clarity, a sense of closure, a feeling that your energy was used for something specific. At other times, though, you have not done anything particularly difficult. You have not solved anything complex. You have not focused deeply on anything at all, and yet you still feel mentally exhausted. That is where the confusion begins. On the surface, the two experiences look the same. In both cases, there is mental activity. In both cases, there are thoughts moving through your mind. But the quality of that activity is completely different. What almost no one notices is that very often the issue is not thinking too much, but not being able to distinguish thinking from noise. Everything gets placed into the same category, as if all mental activity were equivalent, and it is not. There is a kind of mental activity that organizes, clarifies, and directs. And there is another kind that simply fills space, repeats itself, goes in circles, and consumes energy without producing understanding. From the inside, however, these two experiences can feel very similar at first. Both involve thoughts. Both involve inner words, mental images, small simulations. That is why it is so common for someone to feel like they think too much without being able to explain what is actually happening inside their own mind. This difficulty in distinguishing creates a curious effect. People begin to treat every thought as something potentially tiring or undesirable, as if the mind itself were the problem. But that only creates more noise. Because when you try to reduce mental activity without understanding what is happening, you start observing your own mind in a tense way. Every thought becomes something to interrupt. Every inner movement becomes an annoyance. And this constant monitoring adds even more activity to a system that is already overloaded. Here is a point that confuses many people. The discomfort does not come from the number of thoughts, but from the quality of your relationship with them. In many cases, what is happening is not an excess of thinking, but an excess of repetition. The same ideas returning, the same scenes being replayed, the same questions resurfacing without clear answers. Nothing moves forward. Nothing gets resolved. Nothing deepens. And that is far more exhausting than genuine thinking. You can notice this in simple everyday situations. When you are truly engaged in something that requires reasoning, time passes more quickly. The mind feels occupied, but not heavy. But when your head just feels full, without focus or direction, time seems to drag. And in the end, there is a sense of wear that feels disproportionate to what actually happened. Still, internally, all of this gets labeled as thinking too much. This generalization prevents people from noticing something essential. Not all mental activity carries the same weight. Not every thought consumes energy in the same way. There is an important difference between thinking and having a busy mind, between reasoning and ruminating, between clarity in formation and noise in repetition. As long as this difference goes unnoticed, everything feels the same, and the mind starts to be experienced as a chaotic, tiring place, hard to live in. Understanding this initial confusion is essential because it is the starting point for everything that follows. As long as thinking and noise are treated as the same thing, any attempt to ease mental fatigue tends to fail. Before talking about tiredness, focus, or clarity, it is necessary to look more carefully at what is actually happening when you feel that your mind will not stop. Because what is excessive is not always thinking. Often, it is something quite different. When you begin to observe more carefully what is happening inside the mind, the difference between thinking and producing noise becomes clearer. And this clarity does not come from an abstract concept, but from direct experience of how the mind behaves in each case. Thinking, in its most basic and functional sense, has direction. There is a starting point. There is a clear object. There is some movement towards something, even if that something is not fully defined at the beginning. You think in order to understand. You think in order to organize. You think in order to resolve or elaborate. Even when thinking is complex, it carries a sense of progression. Something fits. Something becomes clearer. Something moves forward, even if slowly. Mental noise works differently. In noise, there is no clear direction. There is no noticeable progress. There is movement, but it is circular, repetitive, without arrival. The same ideas return. The same scenes reappear. The same questions arise without producing new answers. What almost no one realizes is that noise does not come from complexity, but from the absence of purpose. The mind is active, but it is not going anywhere. That is why noise is so tiring. Not because it is intense, but because it does not end. Thinking, when it has direction, tends to close naturally. You reach a provisional conclusion, or you realize you need more information, or you simply feel that a cycle has ended. With noise, that closure does not happen. The mind gets stuck in small loops, incomplete ideas that never complete themselves, analyses that do not lead to decisions, simulations that do not result in any real action. And still, all of this is experienced as thinking. Here is the point that changes how this difference is understood. Noise is not a lack of intelligence, but an excess of activity without function. The mind is working, but without a clear criterion for stopping. It keeps processing because it cannot find a natural place to pause. A simple example helps make this more concrete. Imagine you need to solve a real problem. You sit down, think, analyze options, consider consequences. Even if it takes time, there is a sense of engagement. At the end, you feel tired, but you also feel that something was accomplished. Now imagine a moment when you do not need to solve anything specific. The mind starts revisiting old conversations, imagining better responses, anticipating future situations without any real context. None of this requires a decision right now. None of it needs to be resolved in that moment. And yet, the mind keeps circling around these ideas. That is noise. It looks like thinking, but it does not produce understanding. It fills space, but it does not build clarity. And because it has no defined goal, it does not end on its own. It feeds on its own repetition. Another important point is that noise often disguises itself as usefulness. It feels like preparation. It feels like care. It feels like attention to detail. But in practice, it is not preparing anything. It is simply keeping the mind occupied. Genuine thinking tends to bring a sense of internal alignment. Even when it is difficult, there is coherence in the process. Noise, on the other hand, fragments the experience. The mind jumps from one topic to another without going deeply into any of them. This helps explain why, after long periods of mental noise, the feeling is not only tiredness, but confusion. As if the mind had been active, but without producing anything solid. And this confusion leads many people to believe that the problem is thinking too much, when in reality the problem is confusing activity with clarity. As long as this difference is not recognized, the mind continues to be treated as something that needs to be silenced, controlled, or reduced. But that does not resolve noise. Often it creates even more, because trying to stop noise without understanding it is like trying to interrupt a movement without knowing where it comes from. Recognizing that thinking and noise are different experiences is the first step toward understanding why some forms of mental activity energize while others drain. And this understanding opens space to look more carefully at the specific cost of noise, which is different and usually greater than the cost of directed thinking. When this difference becomes more visible, something important is revealed about the mental fatigue many people feel. It is not thinking itself that drains energy most intensely. It is noise. Noise is more tiring because it keeps the mind active without offering any natural point of rest. There is no conclusion, no closure, no sense that something has truly been processed. Thinking, when it has direction, tends to include internal pauses. Even in the middle of effort, there are small moments of relief, partial clarity, organization. Noise does not offer that. It keeps attention trapped in short, repetitive, fragmented cycles. And each cycle requires a bit of energy to start again. What almost no one realizes is that noise demands constant vigilance. The mind keeps watching its own activity, checking thoughts, jumping from one theme to another, never staying long enough to close anything. This creates a kind of wear that is different from classical intellectual effort. It is not the tiredness that comes from using the mind intensely on something difficult. It is the tiredness that comes from being unable to leave a mode of continuous monitoring. This wear shows up in small details of everyday life. For example, at the end of the day, when you look back and realize you did nothing particularly complex. Even so, your mind feels exhausted. There is no sense of completion, no clarity about what was actually thought through or resolved. Another common example appears during moments of rest. You sit down, try to relax, but the mind remains occupied. It is not solving anything. It is simply revisiting small things, jumping from one idea to another. This creates the feeling that rest does not work. Not because you do not know how to rest, but because noise remains active. Noise also affects clarity. When the mind spends too much time in this mode, it becomes harder to see what truly matters.
Everything starts to carry the same weight. Everything feels equally relevant. Simple decisions begin to require more effort, not because they are difficult, but because the mind is already saturated with small, unresolved fragments. Focus is affected as well. When you try to concentrate on something specific, noise competes for attention. Parallel thoughts arise. Random associations appear, not because you are naturally distracted, but because the mind has become accustomed to operating without a clear hierarchy. Here is another point that often confuses people. Noise is not loud, it is subtle. It does not appear as an avalanche of intense thoughts. It shows up as a continuous flow of small ideas, light concerns, silent revisions. And precisely because it is subtle, it goes unnoticed. People feel the effect, but they do not identify the cause. Over time, this mode of functioning creates a constant sense of mental heaviness, as if the mind were always a little too full, as if there were not enough inner space to breathe clearly. This weight does not come from a single unresolved problem. It comes from many small mental movements that never close, and that explains why noise can be more tiring than thinking deeply about something important. Deep thinking has a purpose. Noise merely occupies. When the mind spends long periods in this state, mental energy is drained continuously. There are no peaks of effort, but there is constant consumption. And because this consumption does not draw attention, it accumulates. You keep functioning, you keep handling what needs to be done, but with less clarity, less lightness, less internal margin. This hidden cost of noise is rarely recognized. People feel the tiredness, but believe the problem is thinking too much, when in fact it is thinking without direction. Noticing this changes how the mind itself is understood, because the problem stops being mental activity as such and becomes the quality of that activity. And this shift in perspective is essential for reaching a fairer, clearer reframing, where thinking stops being seen as the enemy and the confusion between activity and clarity finally begins to dissolve. When all of this starts to organize in this way, the relationship with the mind changes tone, because it becomes clear that thinking was never the core problem. The problem was always the confusion between mental activity and mental clarity. Thinking, when it has direction, tends to move you closer to something, to better understanding, to a clearer decision, to a sense of internal alignment, even if temporary. Noise does the opposite. It creates the feeling of movement without displacement. The mind is busy, but it is not going anywhere. When these two experiences are confused, something important is lost. People begin to treat all mental activity as equally tiring, as if the mere fact of thinking were already too much. This creates constant tension with the mind itself. Every thought becomes a potential problem. Every inner movement becomes something to control, reduce, or eliminate. What almost no one realizes is that this fight against the mind usually produces even more noise, because watching your own mind with suspicion is, in itself, a form of continuous mental activity. The reframing here is subtle, but deep. It is not about thinking less. It is about understanding better what is happening when the mind is active. When you recognize that there is a real difference between thinking and noise, something reorganizes naturally. The mind stops being seen as a chaotic space by definition. It starts being seen as a system that can operate in different ways. Thinking is not the enemy of clarity. Often, it is exactly what builds it. What undermines clarity is repetition without purpose. The constant tracking of ideas that do not ask for attention in that moment, the continuous vigilance over thoughts that lead nowhere. When this distinction becomes clear, the inner experience changes texture. The mind can remain active, but it no longer feels as heavy, because part of the weight came from confusion, not from activity itself. This does not mean that noise disappears immediately, nor that the mind starts functioning perfectly. It simply means that everything is no longer placed in the same category. Thinking begins to be recognized as thinking. Noise begins to be recognized as noise, and this differentiation alone already reduces unnecessary wear, because the mind no longer has to treat every thought as equally relevant. Another important aspect of this reframing is realizing that clarity is not the absence of thoughts. Clarity is the ability to perceive what is happening without getting lost in it. A clear mind can be thinking a great deal, but it is not fragmented. It is not trapped in constant loops. It is not busy simply for the sake of being busy. As clarity begins to form, even subtly, the relationship with mental fatigue also changes. Fatigue stops being interpreted as a sign of personal failure. It becomes understood as the consequence of prolonged periods of noise. This shift in interpretation matters more than it seems, because much of the suffering associated with mental fatigue comes from how it is judged, not just from the fatigue itself. When that layer of judgment is removed, something softens. The mind no longer needs to defend itself. It no longer needs to prove efficiency all the time. It no longer needs to be constantly producing something. This does not create absolute silence, but it creates space. Space between thoughts. Space to notice when the mind is truly engaged in something and when it is simply repeating. Space for mental activity to have more meaning and less weight. In the end, the difference between thinking and noise is not technical or theoretical. It is experiential. It is the difference between leaving a period of mental activity feeling clear or leaving it feeling only worn down. Between using the mind as a tool and being trapped inside its own activity. When this begins to make sense, the mind stops being seen as something that needs to be silenced. It starts being seen as something that needs to be understood. And that understanding, even without promising quick changes or definitive solutions, already transforms the way you live inside your own head.